Hi, today I'm going to show you 3 different ways that you can create a seam allowance guide for your sewing machine. So you might be thinking, hey, my machine already has markings on there. But I found that sometimes those markings aren't totally accurate, or sometimes they don't have the seam allowance that you need. So I always like to start off every project by creating a guide and making sure that I'm using the correct seam allowance. So the reason it's important to use the correct seam allowance is that if you get off a little bit, then sometimes your pattern pieces just won't fit together. So you might sew your whole bodice together, your whole skirt together, and then those two won't fit. They'll just be a little bit off, and sometimes also the final size of your garment could be off and it won't fit the way that you really want it to. So before I start sewing a new garment, I always like to look at the pattern, check and see what the seam allowance is, because designers will use different seam allowances for different types of fabric and different projects. So it's always important to double check and then get your machine ready to sew at that seam allowance. Let's get started. So your first option is to use some sort of tool as your seam guide. This is a Janome machine, and it comes with this plastic tool called a cloth guide. And to use it, you take off your drawers, set those aside, and then you put the cloth guide over the arm. And then you can also set up an extension table with this. And this just stays in place, and then you run your fabric along the edge of the plastic guide. This machine also comes with a quilting guide, which is this little metal piece, and it fits into the presser foot, goes into this little hole, and then you stick it in, and as you're quilting, this can run along another line of quilting, and you can have a pretty big space in between the two. So this one is pretty secure in this machine, and my old machine, I had another one and it was a little bit loose and hard to use. So that's my only trepidation with using tools like this, is that they can kind of get knocked around or loose and they won't stay very consistent. So those are 2 options that came with my machine. You can also buy third-party options, and some will just stick onto the bed and you line it up and run your fabric through. And then there are also magnetic ones. But you need to be really careful with magnets, because if you have a computerized machine, there is some danger that the magnet could harm your machine. So just be very cautious with magnets and maybe consider one of the other 2 options that I'm going to share. The second option is to use a rubber band as your guide. If you have a free arm sewing machine like this, and free arm means that you can wrap something around this bed, then you can just get a rubber band and pull it over and use this as your seam guide. So you'd run your fabric underneath and have it just go right along the edge of the rubber band. The third option is to use a piece of washi tape or painter's tape. This kind of tape is very low adhesive, so after you peel it off of your machine, you won't have any residue left on. So it's a very temporary hold, but it works very well. You can use the piece of tape over and over again, so you can reposition it as needed, and it just stays on, and it's really easy to see. Now I will show you how to set up the seam guide. I'm going to show you using washi tape, but this same method will also work if you're using the rubber band or one of the other tools. So you'll want to get a ruler and slide it under the presser foot. You don't need a ruler quite as big as this, but this is what I have. And then drop your presser foot right onto the ruler. And it looks like I have this lined up pretty well, but you just want to move the ruler and make sure that you have it at the correct seam allowance. So whatever your seam allowance is, it needs to be right under the needle position. And just be careful not to accidentally drop the needle onto your ruler. So once you have your ruler lined up, you can also check that it's perpendicular to the bed of your sewing machine. You'll want to take a piece of tape and then line the edge of the tape up with the edge of the ruler and push it down so it'll stay. Now the tape will just stay in place for many hours of sewing, and if you need to change your seam allowance, you can just do the same process and move the tape to a new position. Now eventually you'll need to replace the tape, but I found that it really lasts for a long time. Well, I hope that was helpful for you. Remember that if you move the position of your needle, you're also going to need to move your seam allowance guide. You can like and subscribe to my channel down below, and let me know in the comments if there are any other sewing tutorials that you'd like to see. Happy sewing!